They're very curious. They want to use your stuff like a toy. There are still. They would have used the roots of this to make tea, medicine, candy. There was a lot you could do with sassafras, and that was one of just many things they used. Any guesses as to what this tree is?
It's a chestnut.
Yes. So this is actually a Chinese American chestnut hybrid. It is a little bit more resistant, especially in this area. Salt pork was a huge way to preserve your meat. And with domestic hogs here in this area, you could just turn them loose until it was time for hog killing season. And with the chestnuts, that was the main thing that the hogs ate. And the old timers around here will tell you that the pork never tasted the same after the chestnuts were gone. But yeah, big things like flour, sugar, salt, they would go down into town and get. And they did try to mill their own corn, which we'll see later, but they would actually take down their corn and have it milled instead of trying to process it up here. So they weren't we don't want anything to do with the outside world. Very much the opposite. I talked a little bit on the way up here. They were super social, and those men were down the mountain every 2 weeks to hang out and see what they could trade for in town. The women, on the other hand, got off the mountain about once a year. But pork was the easiest to preserve. If they killed a cow for meat, they would have to eat it then, which with 100 people, that was not too hard to do. But pork was the regular thing they ate. Now, it is called, in Appalachia, the service berry tree. Build the casket, dress the body, wrap it, all that, and they would put them up in the loft of the barn where nothing could get to them, but they would stay frozen. And they knew when the service berry tree bloomed, the ground would be soft enough to bury the people who passed away over winter.
Interesting.
So this fence here would have been for livestock, because they can move it. They can take these pieces out and reuse them. They can make them higher for larger animals. And when the snow and the wind would start to draft in up here, it would build up and build up until essentially there was a wall of snow there blocking more snow. And the last one we have up here is this picket fence. Those would have traditionally been very sharp and used right around the house. So the women typically were around the house most of the day. Their gardens were right outside the house. The kids were there at the house. They did everything to do with the sheep, from the shearing to the spinning to the preparing the wool. Been told about, she's an old spinster. That's still heavily used in this area, but it actually comes from part of the spinning process. So little girls would spin and spin and spin. They would spin for their households to make things like blankets, clothing. They would spin for the market, for money or bartering, and then they would spin for themselves. Any leftover wool that they had and any extra time they had. Each little girl had a cedar chest, typically to keep the moths out, and they would put their extra yarn in that cedar chest, and that was for when they got married, so that they would have enough yarn to start what they needed for their homes. Willie, this is Willie's workshop. He was a handyman and a half. He could do anything, from delivering babies to making hinges for all the buildings up here. So this was Willie Gibbons's shop. We're going to go inside. This front part here was the woodworking side, and as you go farther back and step through the next door, that was the blacksmithing area. But that's a little bit about the two families that were up here. And at the peak of the settlement, there were 100 people up here that had branched from those two families. Back then everybody had lots of kids, so They had adult children who had children. They had visitors up here. People would come up from Virginia and stay the night up here and have like barn dance parties and molasses stir-offs. And then they would head down the other side into Kentucky. This was, for people that were friends of the settlement, this was the route they came when they traveled. They came through the settlement. Were very social people. They loved to have a good time. They did make moonshine, which we'll talk about when we get to the big cabins. But they like to have a good time, and they love to have visitors. So we'll see a lot of that in the next few stops.
Like that. Back in their day, it'd have been running free.
Yeah. That's soggy.
What? Go ahead. You got it dammed up or something?
Yeah, it just kind of sits there.
Yeah, that's it.
But it stagnates.
Yeah.
That's right. The door is on the side over here. So he would have stood right up close to that window. Stacking was of no matter to him. So it was burnt down. Their best guess is someone got stuck up here in a snowstorm and they were just trying to make it. But they started a fire in the fireplace and ended up burning the building down. So this side of the home, from the middle of the fireplace over, was the living space. Bedroom, living room, attic, all that. And to get over to the other side, you had to come out on the porch, walk down a full-length porch here, and then you could go into the kitchen. So that could keep the living part cooler in the summertime. It had a cover on it with a handle. They would have kept apples and potatoes in there to use throughout the winter. If stored properly with some straw in between the layers, those would be good all winter long. Put up by the big taproot, which was a long, thick taproot. They would wrap the cabbage in its outer, loose leaves and stick it right back down in the hole it just came out of. They would cover it with dirt, and even in the middle of winter with snow on the ground, they could walk back through the garden rows, grab it.
So far, so good.
And it has a very cool, really adventure of turning to open the door.
Is this the first one you
No, this was...
get it? Yeah, I said, put it away.
able to do this with the chimney and save having to gather all these rocks. And this also served as a perfect temperature to keep your pies or your meals. You didn't eat without the whole family. So if she baked a pie in the morning, it could sit here and stay warm. Yeah, that was part of it. That is where the teacher lived. So the teacher came up for just a few months out of the year. In here, this is an original floorboard. So is this one. The smoother they are does not mean removed. They still broke them out in a traditional way, but they're not old enough to be smoothed out yet. This would have been the bedroom. Let's see if there's a hole in this one. There is. So this would have been the bedroom. So there would have been a sourwood curved ladder or simply the headboard of the bed, and they would have boosted themselves up in there to sleep at night. It was warm. This board does come up. It has the ring on it. It would have been covered by a rug. This was where it was kind of like their refrigerator. So in the winter it would have been close enough to the stove to not freeze, but in the summer it's much cooler under the house than it is outside or in the house. But this was also Elijah's escape route. When the police came up over the hill, he was already out the refrigerator, under the house, down the bank, and down the mountain before they ever got to the front door. He was a moonshiner. They were all, for the most part, moonshiners. When the law would come up here, all the men would just go out their refrigerators and down the mountain. Really arrested. They tried to get them, but could never catch them. And never catch them actually in the act of trading it or selling it. But they knew they were doing it. So you could have went down and out without being seen. But the fronts were facing up where you could have seen whatever was coming. But I'm sure nobody came in without them knowing about it. Forgot to tell you all, watch your heads as you go off there.
Looks like they built this section first. And then on to me. You know?
Possibly. Giant clumsy puppies. They're very curious. They want to use your stuff like a toy. There are still yellow jackets, so be careful. I see them. And it is time period appropriate.
When was it built?
I believe it was the 60s when they rebuilt it. And they would have had church services in here. I'm sure they also spilled outside. Lots of people would come up here from church.
252.
Man, he was a good